I want to start out by clarifying I will not be making a normative analysis of the decision to attack Iran. Instead, we will be engaging in an empirical examination to illuminate an understated rationale, one that, to my analysis, is the primary motive behind the conflict. But before I can efficiently do that, first, I want to support my theory by showing how the impact of Hormuz has been greatly overstated in general media. As we begin, it's incumbent upon me to introduce the knowledge pyramid. It'll be a model by which we view the information, and it'll also expose many pitfalls that folks run into when diving into these types of events. Starting at the very top, what you know you know. Now, no item will have 100% certainty in reality because everything has a non-zero possibility, but for all intents and purposes, these are the things that you know. The next one down, and this is the boundary that's most important and most often gets blurred, is what you think you know. So the delimitation between what you think you know and what you know is a very, very important boundary, and we'll address that as we go through these. And the very bottom is what you don't know, self-explanatory, and everything else feeds into that. Everything else is just what you don't know you don't know. And every part of the pyramid should be bigger than the one above it.
Let's jump right into it. The first way to evaluate actual impact would be net barrels removed from the market. So the global oil supply is a little over 100 million barrels per day. A full Strait of Hormuz closure puts about 20 million barrels per day at risk. That's the headline 20% number everyone sees. But that's gross distribution, not net impact. There are mitigating factors that reduce the overall impact. First, you immediately get bypass flows, about 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day. That's based on known pipeline capacity out of Saudi Arabia and the UAE that avoids Hormuz entirely. That takes the initial gap down to about 14.5 to 16.5 million barrels per day. From there, a few buffers kick in. First, strategic reserves. We can look to 2022 of coordinated releases of about 240 million barrels over 6 months as an example of how IEA reserves will mitigate the impact. Next, you have refinery and logistics optimizations, squeezing throughput, crude substitution, pipeline maxing, faster scheduling, things like this. Once again, we've seen this mid-2022 as well, based on IEA oil market reports and exemplified in the cracked spread data of that same time period. Add those together and you get a total buffer stack of about 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day, which means you're left with a net shortfall of roughly 9 to 13 million barrels per day, or roughly 8 to 13% of global supply. Now let's look at what this reduction actually means to the global economy. Naturally, you can assume while the loss of 13% of our energy supply is not great, also not catastrophic. But let's dig into it just a bit. Here you can see the standard approximation economists use. The percentage change in oil prices is roughly equal to the percentage loss in supply divided by how responsive supply and demand are. If we assume about 8 to 13% net supply loss after all mitigation, that gives us the economist textbook estimate of about 44 to 63%. In reality, it's been much lower, about 8 to 13%. And this is a perfect example of how we can relate back to that pyramid we were discussing. We add our total amount of oil shipped through Hormuz at the top. We know it well enough to begin building off of. But things get messy when we consider bypass and buffer amounts, and even the standard approximation. Clearly, if we had exact figures, it would be better aligned with the real price move data. This is also where other sources will tell you what the impact will be and neglect to clarify the veracity of their estimates. They aren't upfront about what is at the top of their pyramid versus the middle. But let's continue for a moment using standard methodology. We can compare that to what we've actually seen. The IMF rule of thumb is straightforward. Every 10% oil price increase reduces global GDP by 0.1%. So if oil raises 30%, that's a 0.3% GDP hit. Yet, once again, the actual data has shown GDP growth year over year in quarter one of 2026. But to cap this off, even if we assume those textbook analyses were right, at worst, with the total Hormuz closure, we'd be looking at no more than 3% global GDP affected, which again isn't ideal, but also not catastrophic. One final point worth highlighting is who is actually affected by the Strait of Hormuz. 65% of the oil moving through the strait goes to China, India, and South Korea, in that order, with China being the largest by far. So while the strait is frequently framed as a global checkpoint, its direct physical impact is heavily concentrated in Asia. Outside of price movements, it has limited direct impact on the rest of the global market. I want to consider oil consumption in the first quarter of 2026. We've actually seen an increase in consumption year over year, and that increase was pretty much in line with 2024 to 2025's increase, and actually greater than 2023 to 2024's increase. This is also an indicator that standard estimations of latent production and bypass likely aren't accurate. To be clear, I'm not putting at the top of my pyramid that estimates are wrong, but I'm also not putting those estimates at the top of my pyramid. Point being, while the actual impact isn't certain, we can see that it has not been catastrophic or even reached COVID levels of severity. Which brings me to my last evaluation of Hormuz's global impact. These are 8 of the most common benchmarks economists use to evaluate global shock. No single metric gives you the full picture, but you can evaluate all of them together. And when you do that here, a pretty clear pattern emerges. Across nearly every category, growth, labor markets, trade, financial markets, what we're seeing is a slowdown, not a collapse. Inflation is elevated, driven by energy, but that's a very different dynamic than what we saw even during COVID or the Great Depression. So taken as a whole, the data shows that even with the Strait of Hormuz disruption, this shock is meaningfully smaller than COVID's global impact and nowhere near the scale of the Great Depression. That doesn't mean it's insignificant. It just means that the narrative of a catastrophic global breakdown isn't supported when you look across all core economic indicators. Now let's discuss what I believe to be the primary motive for the conflict with Iran. While the strait is a significant lever in the global economy, against the power of the US dollar, it pales in comparison. And one of the cornerstones of the US dollar's power is its status as the petrodollar. Now consider that in just the first quarter of 2026, 2 of the 3 major producers moving away from the petrodollar have been taken completely off the board. The new leadership of Venezuela reopened ties with the US, sanctions were eased, and Western companies re-entered into the Venezuelan oil sector, clearly being pulled back into the petrodollar system. And while the attack on Iran is inflationary, its inflationary effect on the US dollar is mitigated by the run of buyers towards the dollar. Because if countries want to secure the possibility of major energy purchases going forward, especially in the near term, they will need the US dollar. Moreover, in just a few months, any meaningful global shift away from the US dollar as the petrodollar has become increasingly unlikely, and there are few stronger incentives than preserving one of the United States' most powerful assets, the global dominance of its currency. The goal of this video isn't to convince you that this is the primary motive. It's to recalibrate how you assess the Strait of Hormuz's influence on the global economy, and to introduce to the center of your pyramid that this conflict may not be driven solely by the narratives presented in the mainstream coverage. And next time you consume information about this and any other world event, be mindful of what section of your pyramid you add it to.